My name's Poppy Smith, and I come from England originally. I didn't get raised in a Christian family. My parents, we never had a Bible. My parents didn't go to church, but they liked it when my sister and I were taken to Sunday school so they could spend Sunday mornings reading the paper and having cups of tea. But I had a drawing to God, to the mystery of God, and I never knew much about that. But in the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, which is where I would go, I got confirmed at the age of 13, and of course had been baptized as a baby, but had a drawing towards God. And a teacher I had picked up on this and invited me to her home. And she and her husband and their little girl went to church the weekend I was with them. And when we came home, they said to me, "Poppy, when were you converted?" And unlike what Pastor Paul just said yesterday in the service, this past Sunday, I didn't know what they meant. And they were meaning salvation. When did I come to know Christ? And so I said to them, I don't know what conversion means. So that day, they shared the gospel with me, and I was so convicted of sin and the need for God's forgiveness and for inner peace that I received Christ that day, and my life started changing. I was 17 years old. I had left school and left home at 16 for various reasons, and my parents were now in Kenya in East Africa, so I was alone. And the Lord brought people into my life who had been in Nairobi, who had been at the church there in Nairobi that someone recommended. And so I felt God calling me to go to Nairobi. And because I was under 18, the Royal Air Force, which was where my father served, paid my way. And so when I got to Nairobi, I wrote to a man that somebody had given me his name and address in England, wrote to him, and he came to see me. And the first thing he said to me was, "Do you know the Lord?" Well, I'd only been a believer 6 weeks, but I said, "Yes, I do." I was so excited at the question. And of course, I knew nothing. But the Lord led me into a very little English church in Nairobi. And there he brought a woman into my life who has mentored me for many, many decades until she passed away. A godly woman who pointed me to Christ. And there I met my husband, Jim, came to America. After several years, joined Bible Study Fellowship. I became the teaching leader in Bible Study Fellowship, much to my total surprise. And during those years, I had a burden to write to my father and my mother. They would come to visit, they would go to the church Jim and I used to go to, but I could never talk to my father. He was very British. You didn't talk about religion or God or faith. It was just not polite. But I was burdened to write to him, and I wrote to him, and I shared the gospel with him. I was teaching John's gospel at that time. I was just burdened to share the fact that if he passed away, he would never see me again. And I knew that he loved me very much. So I wrote to him and shared the gospel and told him, "Dad, the fact that you smoke cigarettes and drink beer has nothing to do with faith in Christ." So he never wrote back, he never said anything. But a year later, he calls and he said, "Poppy, your mother is dying. She's had a heart attack. Can you come?" It was a Saturday, and I got on the plane that day in total shock, flew to England, was with my mother that night as she passed away. But the amazing thing was that God had given me a year before a burden to pray for my parents. I would go for walks here in Beaverton, weeping in the rain and pleading with God for my parents' salvation. A week after my mother had passed away in the funeral, my father came home from the pub one night and he pulled out an envelope and he said, "Poppy, I want you to look at this. Is this something you believe?" I pulled a piece of paper, a letter, and a Gospel of John out of this envelope. And I read it, and it was how to become a believer in Christ. And I looked at my father and I said, "Dad, this is what I believe." And I said, I have been praying on one continent that you on another continent would be stirred to seek God. And God is in heaven, and he answered my prayer. And my father looked at me and says, Poppy, that's exactly how I felt, stirred. And I sent for this 6 months before your mother had this sudden heart attack. I didn't say much more. It was a holy moment in this dimly lit little British sitting room. And I went to bed. The next day I left and flew back to Portland. A week later, I get a letter from my father, and my husband was driving the car, and I broke down and wept. My father wrote, Poppy, the morning you left, I got on my knees and I asked Christ to forgive me for my sins and to come into my life. I never believed that my father would become a believer. I believed it all the time that I prayed for him, that God would answer in stirring him, in making him think about what is life about? Where am I going if I pass away? And yet I could not imagine him receiving Christ, but he did. And eventually he went on to join a local church, to join a Bible study. He knew nothing, but he was a bright man, and he was eager to learn. And I gave him J.I. Packer's book, Knowing God. And when he passed away 10 years later, he had written it, read it 4 times, recording his comments in it and underlining it in 4 different colored inks. My father grew to know God, and I want to encourage you, never give up praying.